The history I'm about to relate, uncovered in the Vatican Library in 1623, certainly ranks as one of the most strange and shocking ever written, to the extent that it initially struck me, just as it did so many others across the last century, as nearly unbelievable. It purports to be an account of absolute evil, for lack of a better word, in human form, written from the perspective of perhaps the only man in a position to see and hear and experience this evil firsthand. It speaks of mass murder, attempted genocide, the most brazen corruption and lurid sexual degeneracy, claimed demonic possession, kidnappings, assassinations, underground dungeons and torture, and a great deal more in a similar vein. Unlike most of the historical tales I've told in other videos, this one will contain no heroes or heroism. This is the unfortunate flip side of that coin. It's a tale of what happens when our worst men become our most powerful men, when the foundations and roots of a robustly healthy and strong nation are decimated, and the state becomes not a unified nation of like-minded kin working towards common goals, but a chaotic patchwork of every type of humanity set at one another's throats, each seeking its own immediate benefit. It's a warning. The author's name is Procopius, a man responsible for some of the most thorough, sober, and even-handed historical accounts of his age. And his explosive work is titled The Secret History. So impressive were his other works, displaying that unique, even-keeled intellectual maturity common to the most genuinely aristocratic natures of his day, calling to mind a Tacitus or Xenophon, that The Secret History was initially thought to be a hoax, or its authorship somehow mistakenly attributed to Procopius. It's only fairly recently, in the broad scope of history, that these theories have been obliterated by a deeper analysis of the writing style, indicating these words did indeed flow from his own hand. So extreme are the contents that, once again, just like others before me, my first instinct was to search for some obviously ignoble incentive or motive behind his words. Something that might cause a man to paint such a picture of the events of his age for reasons other than a service to truth. And though fierce scholarly debate on this very topic produced a handful of possibilities, none of these have ever struck me as especially convincing. J. Bagnall Beery, a historian I appreciate and have mentioned more than once in the past, was among the doubters of its authenticity, a stance he formalized with the publishing of an argument on the topic in 1889. By 1923, mirroring so many of his peers as new facts came to light, he'd changed his opinion, though he added that Procopius, quote, must have suffered a brainstorm before writing it. British historian A. H. M. Jones accurately called it a venomous pamphlet, but goes on to offer the opinion, perhaps formed before its legitimacy was all but 100% confirmed, that it, quote, doesn't deserve the respect which is often accorded to it. Speaking personally, I've come to lean towards the words of a later translator, who prefaced his work with, quote, Procopius was unquestionably on the side of right, and the things which are disgusting to us were equally disgusting to him, end quote. Venomous, yes, yet perhaps equally accurate, necessary, and important. If Procopius and those around him did indeed witness and live through what they claim to have, how could any decent man not be righteously angry as a result? Anthony Caldelis opens up his introduction of The Secret History with the words, Procopius felt that he had been living in a nightmare for most of his adult life. Much like Tacitus, one gets the sense that this is a man cut from the old cloth, with high standards of conduct, decency, and ethics, who was witnessing, firsthand, front and center, a complete and total collapse and degeneration of not just the Roman Empire, but of the, quote, civilized world. Caldelis tells us, Procopius was unique and courageous not only in that he wrote a neutral and mostly critical history of the wars of Justinian, who was a dangerous man to offend, but also in that he dared to write the secret history when Justinian, the great spider at the center of the vast imperial web was still alive. This unique quality infuses his works with the suspense of secrets furtively told, and outcomes not yet decided. I believe he was consoled as he watched this darkness all around him, by the fact that one day, if he should be lucky enough to sidestep the arbitrary whims of these two protagonists and remain alive, he might finally share a wealth of knowledge, the vast majority of which could only be known by him, and would die with him and be lost forever if he didn't proceed with caution. A final note of context before we begin. Our story takes place in the Eastern Roman Empire, centering around the reign of Emperor Justinian and his empress Theodora, from 527 to 565 AD. When I say Procopius is a first-hand source, I mean this. This wasn't some scholar writing in a distant library after the events took place, but a man employed by Justinian to carefully document the goings-on of his day, frequently accompanying the third major figure of this work, the Roman general Belisarius, especially during his battles against the Goths. This Belisarius, once so effective and capable as to earn the admiration of Procopius and even genuine praise from his enemies, the Goths, seems a testament to what becomes of men and empires when those in the highest positions of power and influence represent their worst and most degenerate, and a rot sets in from the head downward. The shift in fortunes, enthusiasm, and energy during this period is epitomized by Procopius's writings, and well stated by Averell Cameron in his Procopius and the 6th Century. Quote, "Indeed, the tone of his narrative changes very strikingly when he writes of the Second Italian expedition. From the lively, engaged writing of the first books of the Gothic Wars, the mood changes to one of increasing sadness and disappointment. Belisarius, whose reputation had reached an apogee for Procopius in his masterly handling of the entry into Ravenna in 540, achieved nothing on his second expedition to Italy. And Procopius, while still under the spell of his hero, became steadily more saddened, and more openly critical. The change shows itself in the texture of his prose. Instead of vigorous descriptions of action, we have short lapidary sentences, conveying the bare and unflattering facts. The third book of the Gothic Wars is pervaded by a mounting gloom and criticism. Procopius was already preparing the full blast of his rhetoric for expression in the Secret History, where he writes of this second expedition of Belisarius with extreme bitterness." End quote. Belisarius, Rome's greatest general of the age, had become a literal cuck, thanks to the machinations of Theodora. A weak and disgraceful shell of a man, and thus a perfect representation of the crumbling Eastern Roman Empire, with the wind utterly removed from its now flaccid sails, drifting aimlessly, seemingly just waiting to die, energetic only in the creative looting of its once great and powerful body, swiftly becoming a putrid corpse. One can't help but notice countless parallels in what you're about to hear with our present age and conditions. And it's my hope that Procopius's words might act as a testament, warning, and education. I can't help but feel this is exactly what he intended them to be. And so, let's begin. Justinian ascended the throne at approximately the age of 45. It's said that even before he officially took power, as he acted as a ruler behind the scenes in place of his increasingly senile and insane Uncle Justin, he was to somehow tear through the entire massive financial surplus painstakingly built up over the years by his predecessors, a testament of things to come. He was said, by Procopius and others, to bear a striking resemblance to the Emperor Domitian, who was apparently considered quite ugly, and who, ironically, was to become so hated by his subjects that they tore him limb from limb to end his life. He was of middle height, with a round face, and though neither physical extreme, was, quote, slightly inclined towards fatness. He was, by all accounts, well above average in intelligence. In one of the few complimentary passages in the work, Procopius speaks of him as fairly temperate and moderated in his personal life, sleeping and eating little, if at all, tireless and energetic in the pursuit of his aims, a contrast to the completely degenerate gluttons like Caligula, who seemingly gave themselves over entirely to sensory pleasures. He was also said to be fairly soft-spoken, and not the least bit prone to passionate outbursts or displays of emotion. And with these few short sentences, we've nearly covered the only neutral or complimentary statements Procopius manages to give voice to in the entire work. It's universally agreed that Justinian's style of leadership was one that sought to glorify and strengthen the state at the cost of its citizens. A path that has had its high points in some exceptional cases, but only when a homogeneous citizenry is laboring together in unity towards larger goals that the vast majority agrees are net positives, as opposed to using it as a means of bleeding dry a multicultural and multi-ethnic population to flood the coffers of a paper tiger empire, under the guise that perhaps new buildings and constructions might somehow hide its internal decay. And where to even begin with Theodora? She was low-born by any objective standard into a family of entertainers, to a father who was a keeper of wild beasts used in public spectacles, and a mother that seems to have been very much a shrewd, yet largely unsuccessful until Theodora's big break, social climber. Several wives of exceedingly powerful men were low-born, and yet later managed to distinguish themselves with their exceptional grace or virtue, or kind-heartedness. Theodora, to put it mildly, was not of this mold. She and her two sisters were, quote, actresses, which, in this period, as perhaps it should be in our own, was directly synonymous with prostitution. This isn't just to say that the public saw the profession of acting as prostitution, but that the women engaged in one were also engaged in the other. What seems especially horrible about the case of Theodora and her two sisters, who were encouraged to take to the stage, and other activities, the moment they were old enough to do so, is that, privately, they seem to have begun prostituting themselves far earlier. Procopius tells us, Theodora was still too young to have intercourse with a man after the manner of women, but she satisfied the unnatural passions of certain wretches, even the vilest of slaves, who followed their masters to the theater and amused their leisure by this infamy. She remained for some time also in a brothel, where she practiced this hateful form of vice. As soon, however, as she reached the age of puberty, as she was handsome, her mother sent her into the theatrical troupe, and she straightway became a simple harlot, as the old-fashioned people called it. For she was neither a musician nor a dancer, but merely prostituted herself to everyone whom she met, giving up every part of her body to debauchery. She associated chiefly with the theatrical pantomimes, and took part in their performances, playing in the comic scenes, for she was exceedingly witty and amusing, so that she soon became well known by her acting. She had no shame whatever, and no one ever saw her put out of her countenance. But she lent herself to scandalous purposes without the least hesitation. And he goes on to offer further details here, indicating that she became known by anyone and everyone around her who might be interested in knowing her. For she was not only without shame, but especially fond of encouraging others to be shameless. And any respectable man who met her in the public streets turned away and made haste to avoid her, lest his clothes should be soiled with contact with such an abandoned creature. As for her fellow actresses, she always abused them most savagely, for she was exceedingly jealous. She had married up, early in her life, to a man named Hecabulus, but, quote, quarreled with him and was straightway sent out of the country, and thus reverted, energetically, it seems, to prostitution, first in Alexandria, then to Byzantium, engaging in her profession in every town along the way. Procopius tells us she became one of the best-known prostitutes of her time. She was known to have had at least one child, who would later be disappeared after inconveniently re-emerging after she became empress, but Procopius states she had at least one more to his knowledge. She was also said to have had several abortions, using the primitive techniques of the day, and, according to more than one account, apparently thought little to nothing of these. Justinian, despite the strenuous objections of the empress of the time, Euphemia, a figure who comes off as the most attractive paragon of virtue relative to her degenerate surroundings. He not only decides to marry Theodora, but prevailed on his increasingly senile uncle, Justin, whom he would soon replace, to permanently change the ancient laws of the land to allow patricians to marry, quote, stage performers. Nothing more, I conceive, need be said about this creature's character, for all the vices of his heart are thoroughly displayed in the fact of so unworthy a marriage. When a man feels no shame at an act of this kind, and braves the loathing of the world, there is thereafter no path of wickedness which may not be trodden by him. But with a face incapable of blushing, he plunges, utterly devoid of scruple, into the deepest baseness. This permanent changing of the laws of the land represents a key component of who Justinian was, and that he was said to be a man obsessed with newness and novelty, a, quote, reformer, a mindset that might be equated to today's progressives. Whether this change was to be good or bad for the public in the long term seemed to mean little to him. The mindset certainly granted him immense power. Theodora was very much of the same mind. She despised the upper middle class and the old guard aristocracy, and delighted in profoundly changing court protocol accordingly. We are told that new and abasing forms of etiquette were introduced at court. Under Justinian and Theodora, it became obligatory that all persons, of whatever rank, should prostrate themselves on entering the presence of the emperor and empress alike. The spirit of oriental servility in the palace was shown by the fact that officials and members of the court, who, in talking among themselves, used to speak of the sovereigns as emperor and empress, basileus and basileus, now began to designate them as the lord and the lady, despotes and despoina, and describe themselves as their slaves. And anyone who did not adopt these forms was considered to have committed an unpardonable solecism. How strange it must have been for the most noble patricians, descended from generations of the most courageous and accomplished men, many of whom had devoted their very lives and livelihoods to the betterment of the empire, to be forced to debase themselves in a servile fashion before an envious prostitute descended from harlots and circus performers. Very quickly, all looking on must have realized this empress was unique, and that the coming years may well be difficult ones. Her habits presented a contrast to the temperance and simplicity of Justinian. She spent a long time in her bath. At her meals she indulged in every kind of food and drink. She slept long, both at night and in her daily siesta. She spent many months of the year in the suburban palaces on the seashore, especially at Herion, on the coast of Bithynia, opposite the islands of the princes, which Justinian enlarged and improved. Sometimes she visited the hot springs of Pythia in Bithynia, where Justinian also built an imperial residence. On these occasions she was attended by an immense retinue of patricians and chamberlains. For Theodora had all a parvenu's love of pomp and show, and she was probably encouraged by the emperor, who, though simple in his own tastes, thought much of public splendor and elaborate ceremonial as a means of enhancing the imperial majesty. Those who attempt to defend Justinian and his reign up to the present day often laud his building projects as the foremost proof of his successes, though neglecting to mention that so many of these seem to have been built for himself, Theodora, and their small circle of collaborators. Their rise was to mark the ascension of the court eunuch to levels of power and influence not seen before, and a dramatic rise in all aspects of court intrigue, which seemed to be consistent hallmarks of all sick or crumbling states or civilizations. Many of these eunuchs seem to have been used as something like intelligence agents to monitor individuals and groups and sow dissension or cause infighting among certain factions. And it quickly became known to all that a court eunuch, especially if a friend of Theodora, outranked anyone and everyone in the empire. When this was coupled with the reputation she'd swiftly develop as someone who loved nothing more than punishing real or perceived enemies, these eunuchs must have been treated with the greatest possible deference, bordering on a paralyzing fear. Procopius tells us her husband must have been well aware that she had an intelligence department of her own, and that secret intrigues were carried on, of which he would not have approved. But she was clever enough to calculate just how far she could go. Many modern academics, in what seems an almost comical attempt to scour the record to cherry-pick enough isolated elements to paint Theodora as a strong feminist icon with redeeming qualities, often cite the fact that she'd later direct a significant sum of the public's tax dollars to prostitutes, presumably as a means of helping reform their ways. And this may well have been laudable, but it becomes much more difficult to view it as such when the totality of context is considered. A running theme in Theodora's reign is her eagerness to fund or assist or otherwise ally with virtually all of the criminal or degenerate elements of the empire, almost exclusively. To the extent that this one redeeming action, so praised by our modern eunuch-adjacent academia, might just as well be seen as her wanting to give money to enrich her friends and the like-minded. However, calling her a feminist certainly seems accurate. To an exceptional degree, here was someone totally allied to their own sex, to the extent that there seemed to exist a permanent and proactive animosity towards all men. Considering her lifelong experience with men, perhaps this shouldn't be surprising, but to witness an emperor and an empire giving her such free license to exercise these demons in the most aggressive manner, without checks and balances, is incredible to behold. J. Bagnall-Bury tells us, Theodora was perhaps too eager to interfere, as a sort of beneficent providence, in the private affairs of individual persons, and her offices were not always appreciated. She is said to have forced two sisters, who belonged to an old senatorial family and had lost their husbands, to marry against their will vulgar men who were utterly unworthy of them, and her enemies allege that in her readiness to espouse the cause of women, she committed grave acts of injustice and did considerable harm. Wives who were divorced for adultery used to appeal to the empress and bring accusations against their husbands, and she always took their part and compelled the unfortunate men to pay double the dowry, if she did not cause them to be whipped and thrown into prison. The result was that men put up with the infidelity of their wives rather than run such risks. Procopius mentions several times, intriguingly, that she seemed to exercise a wholly unique influence over Justinian, and credits her, quote, enchantments. Further context on what he means here is given when he speaks of other women in Theodora's circle, who almost seem to operate in a covert, yet extremely organized and efficient, unified faction. Speaking of the aforementioned General Belisarius' wife, Antonina, who was also an actress, also descended from prostitutes and entertainers, Procopius tells us, she herself at first lived a lewd life, giving herself up to unbridled debauchery. Besides this, she devoted herself to the study of the drugs which had long been used in her family, and learned the properties of those that were essential for carrying out her plans. This last line is made all the more intriguing by repeated references to the sudden unexpected deaths of otherwise healthy individuals who happened to be on the bad side of this coven of women, and others pushed into madness or near vegetative states, or a mindset of completely unthinking compliance. Procopius, or at least the translators of his work, even used the term intelligence agent. In fact, there's a strange reference regarding Theodora herself, before she met Justinian, and presumably in between sex work jobs, as being employed to create confidential reports about factions in the region of Antioch. Where these reports ultimately landed is anyone's guess, and may forever remain an unsolved mystery, but what it suggests is explosive, and something I've not seen any modern writers reference, and Procopius himself only vaguely alludes to, and he even seems to do so carefully. Namely, that arguably the two most important women in the Eastern Roman Empire, both of whom were to develop dominating influences over their powerful husbands, at least potentially seem to have been working for unseen forces, or as members of a secret faction. And factions, indeed, were the name of the game in this era, in this region and environment. The leaders of Eastern Rome, even before Justinian, were becoming masters of manipulation and control. and had long fostered not merely bread and circuses as a means to this end, but a contrived and theatrically managed split, a bit similar to our own Republicans and Democrats in the United States. In this case, called the Blues and the Greens. These were less exclusively political and more of an element of popular culture, but this split definitely had both political and philosophical undertones. They'd largely sprung from the chariot races, a central event and tradition which had become far more than a mere game or sporting contest. The Blue faction contained the establishment and bootlicker sorts, those seeking imperial favor, merchants, eunuchs, and members of the imperial court and their relatives, and the vast majority of the Jewish population, and around this time had taken to mimicking the fashions of foreign elements, such as the Huns. The Greens seemed to be a rougher sort, working men, athletes, men of the middle class, and perhaps those who lacked connections or simply despised the social climbing game. Though my descriptions here are almost certainly inaccurate and unfair, if for no other reason than that they freely evolved and changed shape over time, again much like our own Republican and Democrat notions, and had no permanently rigid fixed characters. Neither side seems to have been very admirable, but especially in an increasingly corrupt state, it's easier to feel some sympathy for the Greens. In an extremely strange back and forth, saved for posterity and tucked away in an appendix of J. Bagnall Beery's History of the Later Roman Empire, from the death of Theodosius to the death of Justinian, notes a heated discussion between the emperor and an angry mob, thought to be from the period of the Nika Revolt, later in Justinian's reign. The men from the Greens faction protest injustice and mistreatment, to which the emperor is noted to have exclaimed, "Accursed blasphemers, when will ye hold your peace?" The leader of the Greens responds, "If it is the pleasure of your majesty, I hold my peace. I know all, but I say nothing. Goodbye, justice, you are no longer in fashion. I shall turn and become a Jew." End quote. The anti-Jewish sentiment in the Greens seemed a fairly consistent theme. The most famous warrior and charioteer of his age, Porphyrius, who was once a member of the Blue faction, but stated that he left due to their, quote, idiocy, was to at one point lead his supporters in violent reprisals against the Jews after a signal victory on the track. The warring between these factions seems to have been designed and stoked to prevent full-scale rebellion, and for many decades it seemed to have worked very well. The masses would attend chariot races, yell and scream at one another, occasionally have fights or brawls in the streets, but the focus of their rage would be one another, helping forestall that type of introspection and critical thinking that might cause them all to realize the corrupt games being played just behind the scenes. According to Procopius and others, so much of the energy of Justinian's reign seems to have been devoted to maintaining this delicate balance, allowing him to take in and spend enormous amounts of money and completely reshape the leadership hierarchy to ensure he might continue to do so without anyone effectively sounding the alarm. Even his relationship with Theodora, from the start, seems to have had a calculated public aspect. For a long time, they appeared at all to be at variance, both in their characters and in their actions, but afterwards this disagreement was seen to have been purposefully arranged between them, in order that their subjects might not come to an agreement and rise against them, but might all be divided in their opinion. The truth of the matter was that Justinian seemed unable or unwilling to ever tell his unprecedentedly powerful wife no. Quote, custom was strained to permit her unusual privileges. For instance, she is said to have received foreign envoys and presented them with gifts, as if the Roman Empire were under her rule. Chosroes was amazed when his minister Zeburgan showed him a letter which he had received from Theodora, urging him to press his master to make peace. Such incidents might well give the impression that the empire was ruled by two co-equal sovereigns, and some thought that Theodora had the greater power than Justinian himself. Such power as she possessed, she owed to her personal influence over her husband and to his toleration of her intervention in public affairs. They seem to have mastered the powerful political magic of accusing others of precisely what they were guilty of themselves, having the dual effect of reducing the suspicions directed towards themselves. After all, how could a person be corrupt if they were so aggressively prosecuting corruption? As well as providing an ultra-efficient means of legally destroying all of their opponents. Much like racism in our day is used by many of those filled with the most racial hatred and animus to prosecute and destroy their opponents behind a legal facade, this stunningly corrupt Byzantine court, seemingly composed of prostitutes and thieves and degenerates and sexual predators of every stripe, ironically chose pederasty as their issue du jour, presumably knowing the Green faction's hatred of pedophiles. Laws were changed to allow a single accusation, even from a slave, provided it was made by someone in the court's favor, to be sufficient for prosecution. And one by one, the most wealthy and powerful Green faction members were accused, convicted, and not only lost all of their possessions virtually overnight, but would often have their genitals cut off before being publicly paraded through the city. And I presume that means the person was paraded, not the genitals. As the public began to realize what was going on, a complete demographic shift began to take place accordingly. There was a continual stream of immigration, not only to the lands of the barbarians, but also to the nations most remote from Rome. And one saw a very great number of foreigners both in the country and in each city of the empire. For men lightly exchanged their native land for another, as though their own country had been captured by an enemy. Justinian seems to have had a fascinating relationship with these barbarians, a relationship all but completely ignored by modern academics, who perhaps fail to connect the dots and make the logical deductions based on the larger context picture. Dots even I won't fully and directly connect within the scope of this video, but will certainly cover in the future. Despite his most elite military forces being small bands of Germanic mercenaries, especially heruls, in a time-honored tradition that would continue for countless generations, extending from the Scythians to Alexander, to the earliest Caesars of Rome, to the famed Varangian Guard, and beyond, Justinian and Theodora seem to hold a special hatred for the Goths and their Germanic kin. Modern academics often write this animosity off as if due wholly to the fact that they were Arian Christians, but this seems to be only part of the larger story. In strange actions which have been scarcely mentioned to this very day, as far as I'm aware, Justinian would proceed to find creative ways to send vast amounts of wealth to Hunnic and Khazarian and related forces outside of his borders, and even seemingly aid in some of their military campaigns, while simultaneously working energetically against the Goths and Arian Christians, almost always covertly, as was the Byzantine way. In a fascinating story for another time, a successor in the collapsing chaos that was the Byzantine Empire, Justinian II, approximately 150 years after the Justinian of our story, so infuriated his people with his incompetent and corrupt rule that he was mutilated and banished. It's mentioned that even this mutilation, the removal of his nose and tongue, similar to many of the attempted hangings and executions of this period, was incompetently performed. A little fact which seems to speak volumes about the caliber of humanity overseeing the fall of this empire. Immediately, Justinian II runs to the Khazars, whom he seems to have already known well, somehow, and marries the sister of the Kagan, their leader, whose name happens, fittingly, to be Theodora, and immediately begins to plot means of restoring himself to power on the Byzantine throne. What follows is a disgusting series of chaotic backstabbing and intrigue, leading to another and even more bloody reign of Justinian II, which again is beyond the scope of this video, but I mention this to hint at a strong and seemingly covert relationship with barbarians beyond the border, beginning almost certainly with the original Justinian and Theodora, if not before, and to hint at the increasingly aggressive and powerful role played by the Khazars as kingmakers behind the scenes. The late Professor Dunlop of Columbia University tells us, "It does not seem an exaggeration to say at this juncture the Kagan was able practically to give a new ruler to the Greek Empire, In the excavation of the Khazarian settlement Sarkel, the well-known Jewish author Arthur Koestler mentions the discovery of the repurposing of Byzantine buildings, which somehow feels appropriate. Quote, "The builders also used marble columns of Byzantine origin, dating from the 6th century, and probably salvaged from some Byzantine ruin. A nice example of imperial thrift," says Arthur Koestler. It was just 2 centuries after the Justinian and Theodora of our story that the Byzantine Empire would officially have Khazarian leadership, with Leo the Khazar. Returning to Procopius and the period at hand, Theodora seemed to hold a special hatred for Amalasuntha, the last surviving Gothic princess of the illustrious Amal lineage, who made the mistake so common to Germanic peoples as they increasingly began to interact with foreign courts and cultures of being overly trusting. To pull back for a moment and view things from a psychological perspective, it might be fairly said that all of our thinking as human beings is projection, and that we're only able to see or understand what we have within us. Like a cheating spouse who suddenly begins accusing their partner of the same, those who inhabit a psychological world of deceit and manipulation and subterfuge naturally suspect others of harboring the same mindsets. And the reverse is equally true. Amalasuntha, daughter of the truly admirable Theodoric, dealt with in previous videos, emerged from a world in which character and loyalty and nobility was of paramount importance, in which leaders tended to be chosen accordingly. With the sudden death of so many around her, finding herself nearly alone in a world of Byzantine court intrigue, lacking the contextual reference points as to how it truly functioned, and the vast difference in moral and ethical caliber of those involved, she grew so enamored with the most positive aspects of this new Roman world, especially the libraries and learned men, that she allowed herself to be ever more drawn in. Though she was said to have been brilliant and capable, because she was less familiar with this new human type, she still would have been very much a lamb amongst wolves. And the foremost wolf, of course, was Theodora. As Amalasuntha made the fateful decision to trust her new friends, and, quote, resolved to change her manner of life and to retire to Byzantium, Theodora, considering that she was of illustrious descent and a princess, that she was of singular beauty and exceedingly active in forming plans to carry out her wishes, was seized with suspicion of her distinguished qualities and eminent courage, and at the same time with apprehensions on the account of her husband's fickleness. This made her exceedingly jealous, and she determined to compass the death of her rival by intrigue. She immediately persuaded the emperor to send a man named Peter by himself to Italy as ambassador to her. On his setting out, the emperor gave him the instructions which I have mentioned in the proper place, where it was impossible for me to inform my readers of the truth, for fear of the empress. The only order she gave the ambassador was to compass the death of Amalasuntha with all possible dispatch, having bribed him with the promise of great rewards if he successfully carried out his instructions. This Peter Barsimes was, fittingly, one of the most foul creatures of his day. Described as obese, gluttonous, and conniving, he was a leading banker and usurer who was to later work with Justinian and Theodora to establish an extremely significant silk monopoly, among others, and all but ruin the farmers and middle classes of the empire, stoking the deep-seated anger which would finally burst forth in open revolt. And of course, Peter was a special favorite of Theodora's, a man after her own heart, seemingly willing to do anything under the sun if it led to greater personal enrichment. It's not detailed how he accomplished the murder, and perhaps the details weren't even clearly known in their day. But it seems he may have sought the help of some compromised Goths, already angry at Amalasuntha for so embracing Roman ways, and raising her son Theodotus in an overly soft, Roman, bookish fashion. Though we may not know the details, it's not difficult to understand the broad strokes. And thus, Amalasuntha, like her father and so many prominent and powerful Goths before her, was to die early under mysterious circumstances, at the hand, albeit indirectly, of a woman whose body count was to grow so vast that it became, ironically, a point of defense among some modern academics, especially before the secret history was proven to be a legitimate work of Procopius's hand, with the claim that such a laundry list of murders surely must be invention. This reasoning strikes me as ridiculous, especially considering it's not merely one or two accounts that support Procopius here, but nearly every extant account that in some way supports, or at least fails to contradict in any way, Procopius's versions of events. The idea that we might let such an individual off the hook precisely because the actions seem so incredibly foul strikes me as the worst of reasoning mistakes. And we haven't yet begun to cover her crimes, nor is it even possible to do so within this video. But I'd like to quote Procopius at length for a moment to give greater context here, and a more comprehensive summation of her character and mindset. Theodora had become suspicious of one of her servants named Ariobindus, a barbarian by birth, but a youth of great comeliness, whom she had appointed her steward. Wishing to purge the imagined offense, although, as was said, she was violently enamored of him, she caused him to be cruelly beaten with rods, for no apparent reason. What became of him afterwards we do not know, nor has anyone seen him up to the present day. For when Theodora desired to keep any of her actions secret, she took care to prevent their being talked about or remembered. None of those who were privy to them were permitted to disclose them, even to their nearest relations, or to any who desired to obtain information on the subject, however curious they might be. No tyrant had ever yet inspired such fear, since it was impossible for any word or deed of her opponents to pass unnoticed, for she had a number of spies in her employ who informed her of everything that was said and done in public places and private houses. When she desired to punish anyone who offended her, she adopted the following plan. If he were a patrician, she sent for him privately and handed him over to one of her confidential attendants, with instructions to carry him to the furthest boundaries of the empire. In the dead of night, her agent, having bound the unfortunate man and muffled his face, put him on board a ship and, having accompanied him to the place whither he had been instructed to convey him, departed, having first delivered him secretly to another who was experienced in this kind of service, with orders that he was to be kept under the strictest watch, and that no one should be informed of it, until either the empress took pity on the unfortunate man, or, worn out by his sufferings, he at length succumbed and died a miserable death. A youth of distinguished family belonging to the Green faction, named Bessianus, had incurred the empress's displeasure by speaking of her in sarcastic terms. Hearing that she was incensed against him, he fled for refuge to the Church of St. Michael the Archangel. Theodora immediately sent the praetor of the people to seize him, bidding him charge him, however, not with insolence towards herself, but with the crime of sodomy. The magistrate, having dragged him in front of the church, subjected him to such intolerable torments that the whole assembled people, deeply moved at seeing a person of such noble mien and one who had been so delicately brought up, exposed to such shameful treatment, immediately commiserated his sufferings and cried out with loud lamentations that reached the heavens, imploring pardon for the young man. But Theodora persisted in her work of punishment and caused his death by ordering him to be castrated, although he had been neither tried nor condemned. His property was confiscated by the emperor. Thus, this woman, when infuriated, respected neither the sanctuary of the church, nor the prohibitive authority of the laws, nor the intercession of the people, nor any other obstacle whatsoever. Nothing was able to save from her vengeance anyone who had given her offense. She conceived a hatred, on the ground of his belonging to the Green faction, for a certain Diogenes, a native of Constantinople, an agreeable person who was liked by the emperor and everyone else. In her wrath, she accused him, in like manner, of sodomy, and, having suborned 2 of his servants, put them up to give evidence against and to accuse their master. But, as he was not tried secretly and in private, as was the usual custom, but in public, owing to the reputation he enjoyed, a number of distinguished persons were selected as judges, and they, scrupulous in the discharge of their duties, rejected the testimony of his servants as insufficient, especially on the ground of their not being of legal age. The empress thereupon caused one of the intimate friends of Diogenes, named Theodorus, to be shut up in one of her ordinary prisons, and endeavored to win him over, at one time by flattery, at another by ill treatment. When none of these measures proved successful, she ordered a cord of oxhide to be bound around his head, over his forehead and ears, and then to be twisted and tightened. She expected that, under this treatment, his eyes would have started from their sockets, and that he would have lost his sight. But Theodorus refused to tell a lie. The judges, for want of proof, acquitted him, and his acquittal was made the occasion of public rejoicing. This was one of the extremely rare victories for justice and the public against the increasingly unjust designs of Theodora, and it seems to have taught her a lesson. From this point forward, she'd never leave punishment in the hands of the public if she could avoid it. Which leads us to one of the darkest chapters in this history. I've spoken of the vast amounts of money spent on new building projects. One of the foremost of these, unknown to all but those in the innermost circle of the court, were vast underground dungeons under the palace. It's anyone's guess how many spent their final days in this pitch-black hell. As complicated as a labyrinth, and which might be compared to the netherworld, wherein she kept imprisoned most of those who had offended her. Into this pit she cast Busus, and although he was of consular family, nothing was known for certain concerning him. As he sat in the darkness, he could not tell day from night, nor could he ask, for he who flung him his daily food never spoke, but acted like one dumb beast with another. All thought him dead, but none dared mention him or allude to him. No one, not even senators and patricians, seems to have been safe from being disappeared in these years. One of those who accompanied Photius to Ephesus, Theodosius by name, although he had attained the rank of senator, was deprived of all of his property and imprisoned by Theodora in an underground dungeon, where she kept him fastened to a kind of manger by a rope around his neck, which was so short that it was always quite tense and never slack. The wretched man was always forced to stand upright at this manger, and there to eat and sleep and do all of his other needs. There was no difference between him and an ass, save that he did not bray. No less than 4 months were passed by him in this condition, until he was seized with melancholy and became violently mad, upon which he was released from his prison and soon afterwards died. And it wasn't just Theodora's enemies who met this fate. The Roman general Belisarius' wife, Antonina, apparently used them just as often to destroy her own enemies. Belisarius, who once caught Antonina in the act of cheating in this very dungeon, allowed himself to be talked out of believing his own eyes, though all around him apparently knew the obvious truth, and many of his generals and peers began to despise him for it. Things came to a head when Antonina's son Photius, from a different father than Belisarius, began to be an obstacle to her free enjoyment of her lovers, and she contrived to destroy him, using agents to set all others against him to the point where he finally exploded, and used his power to drag Antonina's lover to Belisarius to tell the whole sordid tale directly. Belisarius had to have long known most of these revelations, but at this point, his denial of the obvious finally broke down. When Belisarius learned this, he flew into a furious rage, fell at Photius' feet, and besought him to avenge him for the cruel wrongs which he had received at the hands of those who should have been the last to treat him in such a manner. "My dearest boy," he exclaimed, "you have never known your father, whomever he may have been, for he ended his life while you were still in your nurse's arms. His property has been of little or no assistance to you, for he was by no means wealthy. Bred under my care, though I was but your stepfather, you have now reached an age when you are capable of assisting me to avenge the wrongs from which I suffer. I have raised you to the consulship, and have heaped riches upon you, so that I may justly be regarded by you as your father, your mother, and your whole family. For it is not by the ties of blood, but by deeds, that men are accustomed to measure their attachment to each other. The hour has now come when you must not remain an indifferent spectator of the ruin of my house, and of the loss with which I am threatened, of so large a sum of money, nor the immeasurable shame which your mother has incurred in the sight of all men. Remember that the sins of women reflect disgrace not only on their husbands, but also upon their children, whose honor suffers all the more because of their natural likeness to their mothers. Be well assured that, for my own part, I love my wife with all my heart, and should it be granted to me to punish the dishonorer of my house, I will do her no hurt. But as long as Theodosius remains alive, I cannot condone her misconduct." On hearing these words, Photius replied that he would do all he could to aid his stepfather, but at the same time he feared that he himself might come to some harm by so doing, for he was unable to feel any confidence in Belisarius because of his weakness of character, especially where his wife was concerned. He dreaded the fate of Macedonia and of many other victims. For this reason, he insisted that Belisarius should swear fidelity to him by the most sacred oaths known to Christians, and they bound themselves never to abandon each other, even at the cost of their lives. You'll notice even here Belisarius refuses to place blame at his wife's doorstep, and instead largely blames her lover Theodosius, who by all accounts was something of a terrified victim of her intrigues, who knew if he stepped out of line or seriously protested Antonina's obsession with him, his life was over. Photius and Belisarius had to know they were playing with fire here, and that Antonina and Theodora had eyes and ears everywhere. Shortly after, Theodora was able to essentially kidnap Theodosius back to the palace, and triumphantly presented him as a surprise to Antonina. She's said to have stated, quote, "Dearest lady, a pearl fell into my hands yesterday, so beautiful that I think no one has ever seen its like. If you would like to see it, I will not grudge you the sight of it, but will gladly show it to you," before leading him out by the hand, like a kept man and slave, back into Antonina's control. Photius was thrown into the dungeons, to die, it seems, by the women. Somehow he managed to escape, and took refuge in one of the most sacred churches in Byzantium, a practice which may sound strange to our ears, but was a sacred and inviolable custom throughout most of history. Those who took sanctuary on what was considered such holy ground, and who were willing to remain, could not be touched. Theodora, true to form, quote, "was able to drag him even from thence, for to her no place was ever sacred or unassailable, and she thought nothing of violating the holiest of sanctuaries. The Christian priests and people were struck with horror at her impiety, but, nevertheless, yielded and submitted to her in everything." Belisarius, a weak and now likely terrified man, took no account of the oaths which he had sworn, and made no effort to avenge Photius's sufferings, in spite of the solemn vows which he had made to do so. Hereafter, probably by God's will, all his warlike enterprises failed. End quote. Regardless of the reasoning one chooses to embrace, it's true that his exceptional few successes against the Goths in earlier battles were never to be repeated. Theodora may well have been something of a disgusting and disreputable monster, but it'd be unfair to paint the picture that her actions were the most destructive of this leading pair. She killed individuals, individually, and while she may have engaged in diplomatic projects leading to a great more death and destruction, this was largely Justinian's field of operation. And according to Procopius, the man may have been responsible for death on a larger scale than nearly any other in all of history. Before we move to this, a quick point of digression I found fascinating, and that I've never seen discussed elsewhere. During the time of the plague, Justinian fell so ill that it was somehow reported that he died. His leading generals, apparently including Belisarius, made the strange statement that if the Romans set any leader in his place, they'd not acknowledge him. Theodora was so sure that this was in reference to her that she proceeded to summon the general staff and again make use of her dungeons. This is entirely my own speculation. I can't help but suspect the potentiality that the generals made this comment so publicly because they suspected foul play. After all, if even the smallest faction of the stories about Theodora and her character are accurate, does anyone think she'd not consider the possibility of assuming total power at some stage by finding some publicly acceptable means and excuse of making her husband disappear? Justinian, after these strange comments by his generals, was to suddenly recover and resume his duties. Is it possible that things might have been otherwise if the general's intentions hadn't been made clear? Procopius makes a surprising comment with regard to the Goths and their Arian churches. I've mentioned in the past how incredibly wealthy the Visigothic element apparently was, to an extent we'll probably never truly know, as the vast majority of this disappeared into Muslim and Jewish hands after the conquests of Spain, or remains buried along their paths of escape. The Ostrogoths were apparently no less wealthy, and in fact seem to have been possibly the wealthiest people in the known world. Quote, Justinian ordered all these beliefs to be abandoned in favor of the old religion, and threatened the recusants with legal disability to transmit their property to their wives and children by will. The churches of these so-called heretics, especially those belonging to the Arian heresy, were rich beyond belief. Neither the whole of the Senate or any other of the greatest corporations in the Roman Empire could be compared with these churches in wealth. They had gold and silver plate and jewels more than any man could count or describe. They owned many mansions and villages and large estates everywhere, and everything else which is reckoned and called wealth among men. And none of the previous emperors had interfered with them. Many people, even of the Orthodox faith, procured through this wealth work and the means of livelihood. But the Emperor Justinian, first of all, sequestrated all the property of these churches, and suddenly took away all that they possessed, by which many people lost the means of subsistence. Justinian was likely looting an accrued fortune built up over generations of the near total dominance of vast swaths of territory, as part of a Gothic history that still remains to be properly told. He goes on to speak of Justinian's methods. Quote, many agents were sent straight away to all parts of the empire to force whomsoever they met to change the faith of his forefathers. These homely people, considering this an act of impiety, decided to oppose the emperor's agents. Hereupon many were put to death by the persecuting faction, and many made an end of themselves, thinking in their superstitious folly that this course best satisfied the claims of religion. But the greater part of them voluntarily quitted the land of their forefathers and went into exile. The Montanists, who were settled in Phrygia, shut themselves up in their churches, set them on fire, and perished in the flames. And, from this time forth, nothing was to be seen in the Roman Empire except massacres and flight. Possibly never before in history was so much wealth and power transferred in such a short period of time, from one human type to another. Nearly all of those who most closely cooperated with Justinian and Theodora, especially with regard to actions like these, or taxation, or usury, or legal prosecution, seem to have been the most disreputable and unethical scoundrels. And I say this as someone that makes a conscious effort to maintain objectivity in cases like these. It's almost always possible to easily find two sides to every story if one cares to look hard enough, and thus walk away embracing some middle ground as the likely truth. In this case, it seems to be an alliance of human beings fueled by unrestrained, practically demonic greed, a grasping and insatiable lust for power and pleasure and material wealth. It makes the blood boil. The Secret History outlines how this ruling pair became expert, along with carefully chosen collaborators with relevant skill sets, of not merely causing the death of the wealthiest citizens in the empire, but of ensuring their last will and testament, as of their death, granted their assets to the emperor. Procopius flatly claims they secretly employed forgers to create these wills. He mentions a scheme they'd apparently devised whereby any individual in a legal battle with another citizen and on the brink of losing his own property could simply grant it to the emperor, thereby earning his favor. Meaning those who sought legal redress for justified wrongs and the reinstatement of their property or assets, even if they were to win their strong case in court, might then watch helplessly as what was rightfully theirs was spitefully handed over to Justinian. It's said, and not just by Procopius, that suicide was rampant across this period of time, specifically among this unfortunate demographic that lost everything, and knew they had absolutely no recourse to right these wrongs. The non-Germanic barbarians, however, seem to have been everywhere rewarded. Quote, he took a pride in lavishing great sums of money upon them, under the pretext of securing their friendship, just as he did in the time of Emperor Justin, as I have already told you. these Huns, when they got the money, sent to some of their fellow chieftains with their retainers, and bade them make inroads into the emperor's territory, that they also might make a bargain with him for the peace which he was so ready to purchase. And these don't seem to be the, quote, white Huns, many of whom had already pushed into the west, kin to the Hephthalites or the Alans, and which seem to have been the fairly direct outgrowth of the Scythians, and to varying degrees maintaining their ancient traditional sense of justice, magnanimity, and decency. Rather, these people seem to be the element much closer to the Khazars, if not one and the same, as Procopius fails to even mention the word Khazar, possibly just due to translation issues, despite so many other authors speaking to the increasingly close connection between Eastern Rome and the Khazar people in its latter days. Essentially, then, Justinian was robbing the Goths blind and enriching their bastardized distant cousins on a practically unbelievable scale. It's interesting to note, in the centuries after the mass migration of the Scythian and Goth into Europe takes place, those who remained in or flooded into their territories came to be known as the White or Black Huns, the White or Black Bulgars, the White or Black Russians, a naming scheme that denotes exactly what it appears to, and seems to indicate two separate groups that would increasingly mix and merge over the generations. Even the Khazars, at one point, were said by some to have a fair-haired element. According to the Arab geographer Istakri, quote, "The Khazars do not resemble the Turks. They are black-haired and are of two kinds, one called the Kara Khazars, black Khazars, who are swarthy, verging on a deep black, as if they were a kind of Indian, and a white kind, Ak Khazars, who are strikingly handsome," end quote. So it seems likely that even at this late date, with these words written around 940 AD, there was still a small minority, albeit rapidly disappearing due to inevitable racial admixture, of the genetic descendants or relatives of the Scythian tribes. And, finally, we can't ignore the most extreme and fantastical portion of Procopius's The Secret History. The elements which, no doubt, played the leading role in this work being received with skepticism and dismissed by so many. Procopius seems to have come to believe that Justinian and Theodora were, quite literally, demonic. I'll present his words here largely without comment. Make of them what you will. I'll only add this. If such beliefs were held so strongly by an increasing number of individuals throughout their reign, at the very least, this is a telling testament to how these two were perceived by those in positions to best truly know them. Quote, "For the reasons which I have stated, I and many of my position never believed they were really two human beings, but evil demons, and what the poets call scourges of mankind, who laid their heads together to see how they could fastest and most easily destroy the race and works of man, but who had assumed human forms, and become something between men and demons, and thus convulsed the whole world. One can find proofs of this theory, more particularly in the superhuman power with which they acted." He goes on to elaborate, calling these two exceptional, and that, over time, he gradually came to believe their very goal was to destroy and cause chaos, death, and disorder. And it gets much, much stranger. It is said that Justinian's mother told some of her intimates that Justinian was not the son of Sabatius, her husband, or of any human being, but that, at the time when she became pregnant, an unseen demon companied with her, whom she only felt as when a man has connection with a woman, and who then vanished away as in a dream. Some who have been in Justinian's company in the palace very late at night, men with a clear conscience, have thought that in his place they have beheld a strange and devilish form. One of them said that Justinian suddenly arose from his royal throne and walked about, although indeed he could never sit still for long, and at that moment his head disappeared, while the rest of his body still seemed to move to and fro. The man who beheld this stood trembling and troubled in mind, not knowing how to believe his eyes. Afterwards, the head joined the body again and united itself to the parts from which it had so strangely been severed. Another declared that as he stood beside Justinian as he sat, and of a sudden his face turned into a shapeless mass of flesh, without either eyebrows or eyes in their proper places, or anything else which makes a man recognizable. But after a while he saw the form of his face come back again. What I write here I did not see myself, but I heard it told by men who were positive that they had seen it. He relates the tale of a monk seeking audience with Justinian, who suddenly stopped in his tracks in the palace, as if stricken with palsy, and refused to take another step. Only later, after he regained the power of speech, did he explain himself. They say that he distinctly stated that he saw the chief of the devils sitting on his throne in the midst of the palace. End quote. He goes on to relate the tales of Theodora's former lovers who'd spoke of demonic visions, and an anecdote from Theodora's friends. She had a dream which bade her take no thought about money, for that when she came to Byzantium, she would share the bed of the chief of the demons, that she must manage by all means to become his wedded wife, and that afterwards she would have all the wealth of the world at her disposal. Assuming such stories are purely baseless slander, I don't think Procopius deserves exclusive blame as slanderer, considering these were claims not just from sources he trusted, but often from those who'd seemingly held no ill will toward the pair. Considering the emperor and empress may well have been both directly and indirectly responsible for a greater amount of death and suffering of innocents than nearly any who came before them, it's not difficult to understand how such stories or attitudes might have developed. The Church, unaware or uninterested in her history beyond the facade of her claimed Christianity and her assistance to prostitutes, would later go on to make Theodora a saint in one of the most disgusting and blasphemous judgment errors in ecclesiastical history, and a testament to the direction the church leadership would choose to take up to the present day. One of the best-known stories about her in our age perfectly epitomizes the dishonest caricature of her via sympathetic modern academics. At the lowest point of the revolt against Justinian's rule, when the empire was in shambles and most of the court was considering fleeing, she is said to have given something of a stirring speech. Quote, "Whether it is shocking for a woman to speak in the presence of men or to urge on those who are cringing in fear, I think it is not a matter for discussion at the present time, whatever one may think. For those whose affairs have come into the greatest danger, there is no other best choice than to look for what is somehow best. I believe that flight is not in our interest, even if it should be possible, as now, for it is not possible for a person who has come forth into life to avoid death. But it is not possible for one who is ruled to become a fugitive. I shall never be separated from this purple, nor shall I live for a single day if those who encounter me do not call me mistress. If you wish to be saved, my lord, that is not a problem. We have a great deal of money, the sea is at hand, and there are ships. But consider if it will benefit you when you have been saved, or if safety would be exchanged happily for death. For me, the old saying is best, that power is a splendid shroud." Completely devoid of additional context, this may be viewed as somehow courageous or admirable. However, knowing what we know now from all surviving sources about her character and personality, this seems to be very much the opposite. She seems to be stating, quite directly, that she doesn't care if everyone around her dies and the empire burns to the ground. She'll not ever relinquish her own personal power, and the enjoyment she receives from the absolute servility of all around her, under any circumstances. As the final line so clearly states, power to her was everything, not the improvement or well-being of the people or the empire, but rather her own personal power. Considering all I've just shared, one can't help but wonder, looking at our present political leadership, financial powers, and intelligence services, how many of those in foremost positions might be the genetic, cultural, or spiritual descendants of these two and their broader inner circle. Procopius seems to have mentioned more than once, with hope in his heart, that after their deaths, the truth would come to light. In fact, this seems to have been a leading reason he wrote this work. This never happened. Calling to mind that all-important Solzhenitsyn quote, regarding the mass human slaughter committed by the Bolsheviks, which was to even far exceed Justinian and Theodora's toll, specifically the last line. The fact that most of the world is ignorant and uncaring about this enormous crime is proof the global media is in the hands of the perpetrators. And perhaps it's never been otherwise. It's worth noting that our term media comes from the literal location of media in ancient Persia, and Hollywood is derived from the holly wood used by Druids in their rituals, magic, and, quote, enchantments, a word Procopius himself uses several times in reference to the actions of Theodora and her circle. The Medes seem to have been, at one point long ago, of Aryan stock, as was the vast majority of what we today call Iran. The historian Justin tells us the Parthians, in whose hands the Empire of the East now is, having divided the world, as it were, with the Romans, were originally exiles from Scythia. This is apparent from their very name, for in the Scythian language, exiles are called Parthai. End quote. He goes on to describe them as faithless, insolent, rough, and quarrelsome, and a relatively lawless survival of the fittest environment. This may have been a bit harsh, and keep in mind he's writing in the 3rd century AD, after the region truly had devolved into chaos, in what I believe to be a testament to the dangers of strong men living divorced from the higher laws capable of channeling such energy towards noble ends. The practice of slavery became rampant, and the specter of incessant court intrigues, poisoning, and assassinations reared its ugly head, and something very strange occurs. The coins struck in these eras, showing the ruling kings and princes and leaders, shift from showing a relatively consistent and uniform human type to suddenly a very different type entirely, as we enter what's now been termed the Parthian Dark Age, in which our understanding becomes so muddled that even today it's incredibly difficult to properly sort out. This shift seems to mirror what seems to have occurred in India, Egypt, and much of Mesopotamia, the Caucasus and Scythia, and finally Greece and the Eastern Roman Empire. And some might argue, a shift that then spread throughout Europe with the help of the Venetian and Phoenician elements, and an increasingly corrupt church, led by men who, like the Pharisees of old, seem to everywhere neglect the spirit of the law and embrace only its letter, and then seek to everywhere install themselves as masters of this letter, to subjectively interpret or reinterpret and impose this new law to their own benefit. I've come to believe Procopius was a good man, with noble mindset, and a personality that couldn't help but feel disgust at what he seems to have viewed as a covertly spreading cancer. Having a sense for history, I believe he understood the ramifications of this unchecked, degenerative chaos, and his work seems to have been an attempt to sound the alarm. Considering the work was buried away in the Vatican Library until recently, and since its discovery has largely been passed only between modern academics attempting to find reasons to dismiss or minimize it, one might say it was a failed attempt. So, this video is something of a tribute to the man, his work, and what I believe to be his warning. The names and faces of the specific actors on the stage may have changed, as they always will with time. But if we pull back and view things in the broad, it's easy to see his warning is just as valid today as it's ever been, and that this very same battle rages on.